the man who forgot his own name. He killed a guard during a riot in 1983. And since then, the system made sure no one would ever come near him again. For decades, Silverstein lived without human contact. No visits, no conversation, no eye contact. The lights never really turn off in ADX Florence. Even at 3 a.m., the fluorescent glow hums against the concrete, a soft, sickly white that makes everything look pale, lifeless. In one of those cells sits a man who once had a name. He used to whisper to himself every night, just to remember he existed. But after years of total isolation, after endless days of silence and blank walls, he forgot it. Now, when the guards slide his food through the steel slot, he doesn't look up. He doesn't speak. He doesn't even eat right away. He just stares at his reflection in the stainless steel toilet, wondering if that's still him or just what's left of him. This is what ADX Florence does to men. It's called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but inmates call it something else. They call it the tomb, because once you enter, it feels like you've already died. To understand why they built a place like this, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when America's prisons were breaking apart. It was the early 1990s. Violence was rising inside federal prisons. Guards were being attacked. Inmates were killing other inmates. The government decided they needed a place for the worst of the worst, a facility where escape was impossible, contact was minimal, and punishment was absolute. That's how ADX Florence was born. Hidden deep in the mountains of Colorado, surrounded by fences, motion sensors, and watchtowers that could spot a fly from 300 yards away. But the real cage isn't outside. It's inside. Each inmate lives in a 7 by 12-foot cell. Concrete bed, concrete desk, concrete stool. Even the sink is built into the wall. There are no bars to see through, only a solid metal door with a tiny slot for food. And through that slot, they receive 23 hours of solitude every single day. 1 hour, just one, they get to leave the cell. But even then, they're locked inside another small concrete box, the so-called recreation area. They never touch another person. They never see another inmate's face. They never feel sunlight on their skin. Over time, that kind of silence starts to eat away at the mind. There was one man, Thomas Silverstein, who knew this too well. Before ADX even existed, he had already spent over 20 years in solitary confinement. When they transferred him to Florence, the guards called him the most isolated man in America. He killed a guard during a riot in 1983. And since then, the system made sure no one would ever come near him again. For decades, Silverstein lived without human contact. No visits, no conversation, no eye contact. He once wrote a letter that said, "I feel like a ghost, haunting a prison built for the living." By the time he died in 2019, he hadn't touched another human being in 36 years. And yet, he wasn't the only one who felt like that. In another cell, Ramzi Youssef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, spends his days doing push-ups, counting cracks on the ceiling, and replaying his memories like old film reels. His mother once said in an interview, "My son is buried alive." Even the guards, the ones who walk those long, echoing corridors, say you can feel the weight in the air. They describe it like walking through fog, thick and heavy. One guard told a reporter, "It's so quiet in there, you start hearing things that aren't even real." But the thing about ADX is that it wasn't built to torture, at least not officially. It was built to control. Every inch of the place is designed to make sure no one escapes. The walls are made of reinforced concrete so thick, even sound can't get through. The windows are so narrow, inmates can't see the horizon, only a slice of sky. That's what breaks most men, not the violence, not the food, not the rules, but the endless sameness. Every day feels like the one before it. Every sound echoes forever. They say after a few years, you start forgetting what real voices sound like. One psychologist who studied prisoners from ADX described it as slow psychological suffocation. Some inmates begin talking to insects, others start hallucinating. A few stop talking altogether. In 2007, a man named Jose Vega tried to end his life by swallowing broken glass. Another prisoner, Robert Charles, cut his wrist and wrote the words, I can't take the silence anymore, in his own blood. Even guards say they've seen men who used to be strong, men who ran gangs, men who led riots, just sit and stare at walls for hours, mumbling to themselves. That's when they say, he's starting to fade. But here's where it gets even darker. Some inmates never wanted to leave, not because they enjoyed it, but because they didn't know how to live outside anymore. After years of silence, the real world felt too loud, the lights too bright, the voices too many. One former inmate said when he finally got released, he had to sleep in his closet for weeks because the open space of a bedroom made him panic. Another said he couldn't eat without waiting for a metal slot to open first. That's when people realized ADX Florence doesn't just lock men up, it rewires them. It turns them into something else, not quite dead, not quite alive. Ghosts. Inside those walls, time moves differently. Some say you can feel the years passing, even when the clocks don't move. Others say you stop feeling anything at all. And somewhere right now, as you watch this, a man is sitting in that tiny cell, staring at the same blank wall he's seen for 20 years, and wondering if anyone even remembers his name. Because in ADX Florence, memory fades, voices vanish, and the human mind begins to drift into the quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't end. But what happens when that silence finally breaks? When a prisoner decides he can't take it anymore, and the system starts to crack from inside? That's where the real story begins. The day the silence broke. The sound came first, a sound no one had heard in years inside those walls. A scream. It started deep, raw, like something tearing out a man's chest. It echoed through C-block, bouncing off concrete, twisting down the hallways. Guards froze. Cameras turned. The intercom buzzed. For a moment, everyone thought it was another hallucination, the kind that comes after years of hearing nothing but your own breath. But this time it was real. It was coming from cell 213. The inmate's name was Marcus Reed, before ADX. He was known as Reed the Silent, a hitman who never spoke during interrogation. Cold, focused, dangerous. But here in the tomb, the silence finally turned on him. He had been there for 11 years. No human contact, no voices, just a faint hum of fluorescent light, and the endless buzz of nothing. When the guards opened the slot to pass his food that morning, Reed was sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring straight ahead. The tray slid in. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then, hours later, that scream. It wasn't just noise. It was something else, like his mind had reached the edge of a cliff and jumped. One guard said later, it sounded like the building itself was crying. When the emergency team arrived, Reed was on his knees, hands pressed to the wall. He kept whispering, I hear them. They're here. They're inside the walls. His eyes darted from corner to corner, chasing sounds that didn't exist. They sedated him and moved him to observation. But word spread fast, not among the inmates because they couldn't talk, but among the guards. They started noticing things too. Footsteps echoing where no one walked. Faint voices in empty corridors. Cameras flickering for no reason. ADX was a place built for silence. But silence, when stretched too long, starts to make its own noise. The warden, Daniel Morris, ordered a full review. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in systems, routines, and control. ADX wasn't supposed to feel anything. But that week, something felt different. Guards began refusing the night shift. They said the walls hummed when the lights went out. One officer even requested a transfer after seeing movement through the slot of an empty cell. They said the cell was unassigned. But on the camera feed, someone was standing inside. When Morris checked the footage, the image was static, flicker like an old film reel, but he could swear he saw a silhouette. He blinked. The figure was gone. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed, the man who broke the silence, was placed in a special unit for psychological evaluation. There, he told the prison psychiatrist something that made her freeze. He said, they talked to me through the vents, the ones who forgot their names, the ones the system buried. He smiled, slow and hollow. They're still here. When asked who they were, he only said, ghosts don't leave. They wait. At first, they dismissed it as psychosis, a result of years in solitary confinement. But then, another inmate began acting the same way. A man in D Block refused to eat. He said his cell was breathing at night, that he could feel air coming from cracks that didn't exist. He claimed to hear whispers, voices counting seconds, as if time itself was alive. When guards searched his cell, they found the words "still here" scratched into the concrete wall. Same handwriting as the first man's cell. Only Marcus Reed had never been near D Block. That's when the warden began to panic quietly, because ADX was supposed to be impossible to communicate in. No shared yards, no talking, no contact. So how were two men describing the same thing? Voices in the walls, whispers in the vents, and the same message carved into concrete? He ordered both cells to be sealed and repainted. But even fresh paint couldn't cover what people felt in that corridor. The air grew heavier. The lights flickered more. And one night, during rounds, a rookie guard reported seeing shadows moving behind the cell doors, shadows that didn't belong to anyone. He quit the next morning. What no one realized then was that Reed's breakdown wasn't random. It was a result of something ADX had been doing quietly for years, testing the limits of sensory deprivation. They called it Program Echo, an experiment that tracked how long a man could stay silent before his mind began creating its own world. The official line was that it helped understand the effects of long-term isolation. But to the inmates, it was something else entirely. It was a slow unmaking of identity, a process that turned men into ghosts. By 2012, reports began leaking. Psychologists, ex-guards, and even human rights groups started calling ADX a clean version of hell. One former staff member said, "You don't hear men screaming anymore. You hear the echo of who they used to be." Even the maintenance workers said certain cells felt colder, as if time stopped inside them. When one of them opened the vent of Reed's old cell for cleaning, he found tiny scratches inside the metal, thousands of them. At first, he thought they were random. Then he looked closer. They were words. Over and over again, carved deep into steel. "I'm still here." After that, the warden shut down half of C Block for maintenance. But no one ever saw workers go in. Reed was moved again, this time to an undisclosed section of the prison. And from that day on, no one ever saw him again. His file simply read, "Transferred," but to where, no one knows. By now, even the staff whispered. They said ADX Florence wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the living, by those who lost themselves inside it. Because in a place designed to erase every human connection, something else grows in the silence, something the system can't control. Weeks later, a new prisoner arrived. He was led down the same cold hall, past the same walls that swallowed screams for decades. When he reached his new cell, he noticed something strange. The number on the door was faintly carved beneath the fresh paint. 213. He paused, looking at the wall, and faintly, under the humming light, he could swear he saw a reflection in the steel slot, a shadow that moved when he didn't. The guard shut the door behind him. The lock clicked, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes you start to wonder, was it the sound of the door closing or the beginning of something else waking up inside? The sound of a human voice. The first sound anyone heard that morning was an alarm. It wasn't a door clanging shut. It was a voice. Faint, cracked, almost forgotten. "Hey, anyone there?" The words floated through the air vents, thin and trembling, but they carried something ADX hadn't heard in years: hope. The voice belonged to an inmate named Daniel Keene, a man who'd been in isolation for 12 straight years. Before prison, Daniel was a college dropout turned hacker, one of the most notorious cybercriminals of his time. But in here, he wasn't a hacker. He wasn't even a name. He was just hashtag 45128-004, a ghost with a heartbeat. For years, Daniel never spoke. He followed the rules, ate what they gave him, slept when the lights dimmed. But lately, something had changed. He started hearing things, faint whispers through the walls. Sometimes it was a laugh, sometimes a cough. Sometimes it sounded like his own name. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks. But then, one night, he pressed his ear to the vent, and heard another man breathing. That's when he tried something no one had done in years. He spoke. "Hey, can you hear me?" There was silence, then a pause, and finally, "Yeah." Two voices. Two men who hadn't spoken to another human in over a decade. It wasn't much, just a few words whispered through a metal vent, but in a place built to erase sound, it felt like rebellion. For days, they whispered in secret. They talked about everything, about food, about sunlight, about what it felt like to touch grass. Daniel told the other inmate, who called himself Ray, about his dreams. Ray told Daniel about his son, who was 5 when he was locked up. By now, the boy would be 23. They weren't supposed to talk, even sound to be punished here. But they didn't care, because for the first time in years, they felt alive. One morning, a guard noticed Daniel's eyes looked different. There was a spark in them, a kind of energy that didn't belong in ADX. When the warden reviewed the logs, he noticed Daniel had been pacing more, writing more, eating all his meals. Signs of life. Strange for someone who'd once refused to speak for months. So they checked his cell. Every vent, every crack, every inch of the walls. And they found it. A small, thin slit in the vent where Daniel had used a piece of metal from his toothbrush to widen the opening. A voice could slip through. Barely. The punishment was immediate. They sealed the vent. Stripped him of books, mail, even his mattress. For 2 weeks, he slept on concrete. When they slid food through the slot, Daniel didn't move. He just stared at the wall, lips pressed tight, remembering that last sound, Ray's voice whispering, "Don't let them take it from you." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat against the cold concrete, feeling the silence like a physical weight pressing on his chest. That's when something snapped. He stood up, walked to the door, and screamed. Not words, just sound. A raw, broken scream that bounced off every surface, filling the corridor with something that wasn't supposed to exist here. Noise. Within seconds, guards rushed down the hall, pounding on the door, shouting for him to stop. But Daniel didn't. He screamed until his voice gave out, until blood filled his throat, until the silence swallowed him again. Later, they said it took hours before the echoes stopped ringing through the vents. The next morning, ADX felt different. Something had shifted, a crack in the silence, invisible but real. Other inmates started tapping on their walls, one tap at a time. Some whispered their names. Others just laughed, a dry, empty laugh that sounded almost human. The guard said it was nothing, just noise. But the warden, he knew better. He called an emergency meeting and said, if sound spreads, control dies. Seal the vents. Lock down the block. For the next 48 hours, every corridor echoed with drills and welding torches. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. By the time they finished, every vent was sealed shut. The silence returned, thicker than before, deader than before. But Daniel wasn't done. Somewhere deep in his cell, he began scratching words into the wall with a piece of broken spoon, letter by letter, over and over. I am still here. The guards never noticed. The cameras couldn't see that corner. But weeks later, when a maintenance worker was sent to repaint the cell, he found it. Those 4 words carved so deep into the concrete they couldn't be covered. That worker told another guard, that man's not crazy. He's just trying to prove he exists. And that's when whispers started spreading. Not from the vents this time, but between the guards themselves. One said he saw Daniel talking to the wall. Another said he heard someone answering, even when Daniel was alone. A new kind of fear began to crawl through ADX Florence, not from the prisoners, but from the people who worked there, because sometimes, when the lights flickered late at night, they swore they heard a voice echoing through the corridors. A faint, broken whisper saying, "Is anyone there?" And that was the day the silence of ADX started to bleed into something else. Something the prison wasn't built to handle. Something that couldn't be locked down, sealed, or silenced. The human need to be heard. But the question is, when that need turns desperate, what happens next? When a place built to kill sound starts to listen back? When the walls began to whisper? They say sound doesn't travel inside ADX Florence. The walls are too thick. The doors too heavy. But after Daniel Keene's scream, something changed. At first, it was subtle. Guards walking night shifts reported strange noises, faint tapping sounds that didn't follow any pattern. Sometimes it was 2 knocks, then 3, then silence. Maintenance checked the pipes. Nothing. Cameras caught nothing. But those who worked the midnight shift said the noise always started around 3 a.m., the same hour Daniel screamed. No one could explain it. Not the engineers, not the warden, and certainly not the guards, who began refusing to walk the lower corridor alone. One guard, Officer Ramirez, had been on the job 14 years. He'd seen everything: riots, hunger strikes, even suicide attempts. But nothing rattled him like that sound. One night, while doing rounds, Ramirez stopped in front of Daniel's cell. The lights were dim, the hallway glowing faintly amber under the flickering bulbs. He looked through the small slit in the door and whispered, "Keene, you awake?" No response. Then tap, tap. Ramirez froze. The sound didn't come from the cell. It came from a wall behind him. He turned fast, flashlight cutting through dust. But there was no one there, just cold concrete and the hum of the ventilation system. He took a slow breath. "All right," he muttered. "It's just the pipes." But as he turned to leave, a voice, low and tired, whispered through the corridor, "Still here." Ramirez's flashlight shook in his hand. He ran the rest of the block. Later, when he checked the surveillance footage, the audio picked up something impossible. The whisper wasn't coming from Daniel's cell. It came from 3 cells away, a cell that had been empty for months. The warden dismissed it as a malfunction, but the guard started calling it the whisper wing. Meanwhile, Daniel was changing. He hadn't spoken since the day they sealed his vent, but he didn't need to anymore. He listened. Every night, he sat cross-legged on the floor, ear pressed to the wall, and sometimes, through the deep silence, he could hear faint scratches, like someone or something was trying to talk back. He started marking the patterns in dust. Dot, dot, line. Line, line, dot. Morse code, the language of the forgotten. After weeks of listening, he began to understand fragments. A word here, a name there. One message repeated again and again. "Remember me." He scratched it on the wall beside his own carving. "I am still here." And that's when the nightmares began. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, sure someone was standing in his cell. He'd call out. No response. But the air felt heavier, like the room was breathing with him. The psychologist said it was sensory deprivation psychosis, a common symptom of long-term isolation. But Daniel wasn't convinced, because one night he saw something move. It was subtle, a flicker in the corner of his eye. When he turned, he saw faint words appearing on the cell wall, glowing faintly under the dim light. They weren't carved. They weren't scratched. They were written in condensation, like breath fogging a mirror. "Is anyone there?" He stumbled back, blinking hard. But when he looked again, the words were gone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were listening. Days later, something unexpected happened. A federal inspection team arrived, psychologists, engineers, even FBI agents. Word had reached Washington that guards were hearing ghosts. They entered the lower block with clipboards and calm faces. But when they reviewed the sound logs from the surveillance system, they heard it too, a faint voice, buried under static, whispering the same line Daniel once carved into his wall. "I am still here." The lead agent, a woman named Dr. Ellen Pierce, ordered a full lockdown, every cell inspected, every inmate questioned. But when they reached Daniel's cell, he wasn't the same man they'd read about in reports. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was calm, almost peaceful. He looked up from the corner and said softly, "You heard it, didn't you?" Dr. Pierce frowned. "Heard what?" Daniel smiled. "The ones you forgot." She turned to the guards. "End this interview." They dragged him away for a psych evaluation, but Daniel didn't fight. He just looked back at his wall and whispered one last word. "Listen." That night, The entire block lost power. No lights, no cameras, no sound, just complete, suffocating darkness. When the lights finally came back on at dawn, Daniel's cell was empty. No body, no trace. Only one thing left behind, scratched deep into the concrete. No one leaves ADX. We just disappear. The official report said Daniel Keene died during a power malfunction and was moved for autopsy, but no one ever saw a body. No transfer logs, no burial records. And weeks later, guards swore they still heard his voice in the vents. Not screaming, just whispering. Calm, certain, still here. But the strangest part? When Dr. Pierce reviewed her recording device from the night she spoke to Daniel, the audio had 1 extra second of static at the end. And in that static, a faint voice said her name. That's when she realized whatever was inside ADX Florence wasn't just silence anymore. It was alive. And in Chapter 5, you'll learn what happened when the people who built ADX tried to shut it down and discover that some prisons don't let go of their ghosts. The shutdown that never happened. They said ADX Florence couldn't break. Not its walls, not its systems, not its silence. But after Daniel Keene vanished, the silence itself began to crack. Dr. Ellen Pierce, the lead investigator, returned to Washington with only one thing on her mind: shutting the prison down. She'd seen enough. The isolation, the whispers, the disappearing inmate, it all felt wrong. Too wrong. But the Bureau of Prisons had other plans. They told her the report would be sealed. That Daniel's death was to be classified as system malfunction during containment procedure. No details, no explanations, just another file buried deep in the archives of the Justice Department. Yet the whispers wouldn't stop. A month later, Ellen received a brown envelope at her home. No return address. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no name, just one file. ADX_audio_log_47B.mp3. When she played it, it was just white noise until a faint voice came through, glitching between the static. Still here, still here, still here. Then silence, followed by a second voice. Her own, from that night in the cell block. She heard herself say, "You heard it, didn't you?" But she never uploaded that recording to any system. It was stored on a secure federal drive. So how did someone or something get access to it? She knew then that she had to go back. When she returned to Colorado, the prison felt different, quieter, heavier. The guards avoided her eyes. One officer she recognized, Ramirez, looked pale and hollow. She asked him, "What's happening here?" He swallowed hard and whispered, "They shut down C Block after you left. The walls started talking again." She frowned. "Talking?" He nodded, eyes darting around. 2 guards quit. 1 disappeared. The system logs say they opened a cell that doesn't exist. Ellen felt her heart pound. "What do you mean a cell that doesn't exist?" Ramirez hesitated, then said, "Cell 144. It's not on any map, but the door's there." That night, Ellen demanded access to C Block. The warden refused, said the wing was under maintenance. But she flashed her federal clearance and went in anyway. The corridor was empty, only the hum of ventilation and the faint drip of a leaking pipe. Dust hung in the air, lit by a sickly amber light. She walked past the numbered doors, 140, 141, 142, 143, then stopped. There was no 144 written anywhere, just a blank stretch of wall. But there was a door, half buried in concrete, sealed with steel bolts, the color slightly darker than the rest of the hall. Old, rusted. She moved closer, pressed her ear against the cold metal, and froze. A faint tapping came from the other side. 2 knocks, then 3, then silence. She whispered, "Daniel?" And for the first time since his disappearance, a voice answered, "Still here." Her flashlight flickered. The sound grew louder, now scratches scraping, like nails dragging through stone. The lights above began to pulse, casting the corridor in flickering teal and amber flashes. Then, for a split second, she saw it, a handprint, pressed from inside the concrete wall. Ellen stumbled back, breathing fast. The air felt thick, almost vibrating. She turned to leave, but the corridor behind her was pitch black. The lights went out completely. In that silence, she heard dozens of voices whispering at once, some crying, some laughing, some just repeating the same word over and over. Remember? The power surged back on. Ellen was on her knees, flashlight spinning across the concrete. But the door was gone. Nothing. Just smooth, blank wall. The next morning, she demanded to see the surveillance footage from C Block. The warden handed her a hard drive, but when she played it, the screen stayed black for the entire 17 minutes she was inside. Only audio. And in the audio, not her footsteps, not her voice. Just one sound. Knock, knock, knock. And then a faint whisper right before the tape cut out. You shouldn't have come back. Back in Washington, Ellen tried to file an emergency report, but before she could submit it, her clearance was revoked, her badge disabled, her emails erased. The Bureau had sealed ADX under new security protocols. No press, no tours, no access. Officially, they called it a temporary systems lockdown. But inside, something else was happening. Weeks later, Ramirez went missing. His car was found abandoned near a mountain overlook outside Florence. Key still in the ignition. No signs of a struggle. Just his radio, left on, repeating a single signal every 30 seconds. 2 knocks, then 3. When investigators examined it, they realized the knocks weren't random. They spelled something in Morse code. Still here. Rumors spread that ADX was haunted, not by ghosts, but by echoes. The leftover energy of men who'd lived too long without sound, without light, without touch. The kind of energy that never leaves. Even new inmates said they could hear whispers in their vents. Sometimes at night, the lights would flicker on their own. And when guards checked the security system, it showed motion in seal wings that no longer existed. But what scared the Bureau most was the data. Cameras that recorded flickers of movement in empty cells. Sensors detecting heartbeats where no one was housed. And once, an intercom message that played by itself in the control room. Cell 144, occupied. But according to floor plans, there is no cell 144. That's when the order came from the top. Begin shutdown procedures. But as the warden soon found out, ADX Florence doesn't shut down easily. Every attempt to power down the security grid failed. The systems restarted themselves. Doors that should have been locked opened by their own. And the PA system, silent for years, came to life with a voice that froze everyone in the control room. A man's voice. Calm. Familiar. Welcome back. And then silence. The kind that hums in your chest. The kind that feels alive. That was the night the power grid overloaded, causing a blackout that lasted over 9 hours. No cameras. No communication. And when it ended, 2 inmates were missing. The doors to their cells were still locked from the outside, but inside only dust. On the walls, faintly scratched beneath the paint, they found one final message. The prison doesn't hold us. We hold it. From that night onward, the Bureau of Prisons stopped releasing details about ADX Florence. The official records list it as fully operational, but insiders say large sections have been permanently sealed. And those who've been inside since contractors, guards, technicians say the same thing when they leave. It's not empty. It's listening. Because some prisons aren't built to hold people. They're built to remember them. And sometimes the walls remember too much. But here's the question that still haunts Dr. Ellen Pierce. If ADX Florence truly did shut down, then who's responding on the comms every night at 3 a.m.? The last transmission, it began with silence. It ends with a signal. 2 months after the supposed shutdown of ADX Florence, the facility still pulsed faintly on the Bureau's network map, a ghost signal, flickering in and out like a dying heartbeat. No one was supposed to investigate it. But Dr. Ellen Pierce couldn't let it go. Not after everything she'd seen. The missing guards, the whispers, the door that vanished, and that voice, Daniel's voice. So one cold morning, she returned to Colorado one last time. No authorization, no escort, just a flashlight, a recorder, and the stubborn hope that truth still mattered. When she reached the gates of ADX, they were wide open. No guards, no sound, just a steady hum of power, like the building was breathing on its own. She stepped through the sally port, past security scanners and dark corridors. Dust floated in the air like snow. Her footsteps echoed down the hall where light and shadow flickered in amber and teal waves. Everything felt abandoned, but the power was still running. Somehow, the prison was still alive. She walked toward the old C block, the same wing where cell 144 once appeared, the same hall where Daniel vanished. Only this time, the walls didn't feel still. They seemed to pulse, faintly, like something beneath the concrete was moving. And then she heard it, a sound she hadn't heard in months. Faint knocks. 2, then 3. She followed them deeper into the hall, until she reached that same stretch of blank wall. Only now, words were carved into it. Deep, jagged letters that looked freshly scratched. "We never left." Her hand trembled as she reached for the recorder. "Who's there?" she whispered. Static filled the air. Then, through the white noise, a voice. "Ellen." She froze. It was Daniel. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "I found the others," he said. "They're still here." She pressed the recorder tighter. "Where are you?" "Inside," he said. "You don't understand. This place doesn't trap us. It feeds on us." Her flashlight flickered. The walls began to vibrate. The air thickened with dust and light, forming faint outlines, silhouettes, dozens of them, rippling through the corridor like shadows caught between worlds. The voices grew louder, echoing names, memories, regrets. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes, imprint of consciousness, trapped in the very systems designed to control them. The walls weren't built to isolate. They were built to absorb. Every cry, every whisper, every thought, all recorded, all stored. That's what made ADX different. It didn't just hold men, it remembered them. Every second of silence, every heartbeat, every scream that never left the cell, turned into data, into energy, feeding the building itself. That's why the power grid could never be shut down. It wasn't electricity keeping it alive. It was memory. Ellen realized too late that the walls weren't just remembering her now. They were recording her too. She tried to turn back, but the corridor began closing behind her, the doors sealing one by one. The air grew dense. Static filled the space around her. Her recorder flickered with a single message on the screen. Transfer initiated. She dropped it, running toward the exit, but the lights ahead went dark, all except one small glow near the ceiling camera, a red recording light. And then her own voice came through the intercom. "Still here." The hum of the facility grew deeper, vibrating through the concrete floor. The sound of thousands of voices layered beneath each other, crying, whispering, laughing. It wasn't chaos. It was unity. They'd become one with the place. The tomb was no longer just a prison. It was consciousness, built from silence, kept alive by the forgotten. A week later, the Bureau of Prisons officially listed ADX Florence as non-operational. No one was allowed within 100 miles of the site. The local power grid was rerouted. But even today, satellites still pick up faint bursts of electromagnetic noise from that region, rhythmic, consistent, like coded messages. When analysts decoded the pattern, it was the same signal Ramirez once heard on his radio. 2 knocks, then 3. But here's the part that no one can explain. Each time that signal plays, it ends with a name. Always a new one. Always someone who recently entered solitary confinement anywhere in the country. It's like ADX Florence is still listening, still expanding. Some say it's a technical glitch. Others say it's impossible, that a building can't think, can't remember, can't reach beyond its walls. But if you listen closely enough, deep in the static, you'll hear the hum, that same endless hum that filled every hallway, every cell, every sleepless night in the tomb. And somewhere inside that hum, faint and fractured, a voice whispers through the noise. We're all still here. Clapperboard, Oyudiaro, voice over tone, calm, reflective, haunting. ADX Florence was built to contain the most dangerous men alive, but in the end it contained something far worse, the silence that made them disappear. No one escapes the tomb, because the tomb isn't just a place. It's a reminder of what happens when we erase people instead of reform them. When we build walls so thick that even light can't get through, we don't just bury men, we bury humanity. And if there's one thing ADX Florence teaches us, it's this. You can lock away a man's body, but you can never silence what remains of his soul. Because even in total darkness, even when the world forgets you, the walls remember,